Welcome to the sixth presentation in this series, where we're looking at the logic of Christianity. In the last presentation, we established two important principles. God made us rational beings. He gave us minds. He doesn't expect us to believe anything without evidence. There is no place for blind faith, irrationality. And sadly, there is so much blind faith and irrationality all over religions everywhere. God has required us and asked of us and expects of us to worship Him with our minds. In other words, to use our minds to think things through, to look at the evidence. And alongside that, if we accept that God made the universe, then our greatest task is to find out what He wants from us, how He wants us to live. Then our task is to respond accordingly. Two fundamental principles. We looked at the claims of Jesus. God entered our human arena in the life of a human being called Jesus, who taught us what life should and could be like, but He lived it. A living demonstration of quality life. Wherever He went, He confronted evil and wrongdoing. Wherever He met it, He took it on with great courage. He didn't condemn people. He met many people who made a real mess of their lives. But His task was to offer release, hope, purpose, a better way, a great future. And it's still the same today. And He invited people, wherever He went, to join Him in pursuing that better way. Knowing that we can't do it of ourselves, He offers us the resources so that we can live that better way. These are the claims of Jesus. We looked at the meaning of the cross. Now, I pointed out that this isn't necessarily the entire picture, but it's a way of looking at the cross which is very helpful. It assumes that we human beings have messed things up and we need help. And the evidence for that is extremely strong. God came into our humanity. He identified with us in our mess. He came in the life, limiting Himself within the life of a human being, revealing what life could and should be, confronting the evil that ruled the world in those days, still rules the world today in some ways, and then was prepared to go through the worst that evil could throw at Him. When political power and religious power combine, that's the worst. It always is. History shows it. And it does terrible damage to people. Great suffering, great pain, great hurt. And on our behalf, doing for us what we couldn't do for ourselves, He defeated that evil and death because He went through it and He came out the other end victorious because He was resurrected. And because of that victory, He's able to offer us release. We can go His way with His strength, doing it His way, released in Him. In other language, we're invited by Him to enter God's kingdom, to become adopted as God's children, empowered to live in God's family, living rich, full lives here and now, the way God intended it to be. The logic of Christianity and the central meaning of the cross. Now I want to move on and look at other religions. There's an awful lot said about other religions, and much of it is not based on evidence. Looking at the world today, these are the approximate proportions of people who claim to follow various religions. You can see from this that there only are 4 major religions. A significant minority don't claim any religion, and there are numerous other small religions that come in the other category. Time prevents us dealing with them. Despite what is often presented, today, the statistics show it, Christianity has the fastest numerical growth. But the growth is mainly by people coming to Jesus. Islam has the fastest percentage growth, starting from a lower base. But that growth is mainly by higher birth rates. These are the facts. But very often our media present a picture that is not true to the facts. Christianity is not growing in the West, but it is growing at an enormous rate all over the world. Islam by conversion, yes, there are some people converting, but the bulk of the growth is by higher birth rates. And indeed that's a policy, as some Islamic leaders have made very clear. Both of these religions are declining quite steeply. These are the facts of the statistics of the evidence. I want to look at these religious groupings, and I want to look at it under 6 questions. So this is in no way comprehensive. Time prevents us covering everything. I want to look at under 6 broad question areas. And I've tried to draw the evidence from the writings of those from the religious groups, and I've tried to be scrupulously fair. But at the same time, I can't guarantee to cover everything. And within any group there are diversities of views, so there are some variations. But I want to look at the nature of God, what the religions say about creation and the origins of life, what they say about the nature of humanity, the purpose of life, what these religions say about good and evil, and about suffering. Some of the big questions that we started this series by addressing. We're going to take each one in turn. And I'm trying to summarize this, and again I stress it is a summary, and it doesn't cover every detail. When it comes to the nature of God, Hinduism and Buddhism, I'm bringing them together. Buddhism grew out of Hinduism, historically. They accept some kind of God, or a senior deity, because in both religions there are multiple deities. They don't think in terms of God creating, because everything is seen as a kind of endless cycle. But the important thing is that in both religions, this deity is kind of integrated into the creation. It's not separate from the creation. God and creation are seen as almost one. If you look at Islam, it emphasizes the oneness of God as creator and the utter total sovereignty. God is at a distance, sovereign and all-powerful. Strong feature of Islam. But they also emphasize that we human beings have direct access to God. We don't need to go through priests or intermediaries. But the role that we have is to bow and worship. And it's taught very clearly, 2 places in the Quran, that God only loves Muslims. Now that has implications in how Muslims treat other people. God is seen as a person, a deity, a way beyond us, to be respected and feared. And there's an emphasis, indeed, in every single chapter of the Quran, almost every single chapter, there are pictures of hellfire if we don't do what God wants us to do. In Christianity, there is the oneness of God, creator, sovereign, but very clearly separate from his creation, which makes it very different from the Eastern religions. But God loves all humanity. He wants everybody to come to him. And he wants everybody to find the best in this life. The emphasis on this life, not on hellfire. But the freedom of choice is strongly emphasized. Yes, there is human accountability. We're responsible for how we treat each other, that's the definition. But a recognition that we can't sort things out ourselves, we need help. That's a very different emphasis. Let's move on to the second section, the purpose of life. I'm putting up the religions almost randomly. That's the goal. God wants to create a people, you and me, for himself, who possess free will and choose to live his way. And we enjoy the richness of life on earth as he intended it to be, along with a full life thereafter. God just wants the best for humanity, so that we live the way we were created to live. The Quran teaches very strongly that life is a preparation for the life beyond death. In some places it makes the point that this life is of little importance compared to the life after death. But it stresses how we live here determines whether we have any chance of paradise after death. Hinduism. 4 kind of words here. It lays emphasis on moral and ethical living. It tries to describe that, but there are some variations. That's the top important thing. It lays stress on pursuing wealth and prosperity. And indeed, gaining wealth and prosperity is a sign of God's favour. That has implications on how you treat others. It lays stress on obtaining enjoyment from this life. Fulfillment. The end goal is enlightenment. Now that's really described as ultimately unity with God, but remember these are strongly Eastern ideas and they're not easy for us with Western minds to grasp. Unity with God, but this may require us coming back in one or more incarnations, being reborn after death, as a human or as a lower form of life. Buddhism, purpose of life. It addresses suffering. The primary purpose is to end suffering. It sees suffering caused by continual striving after things that don't really give happiness. It recognizes the impermanence of all things. And if we do that, we lessen suffering. And eventually to end this recycling of rebirth and reincarnation. And it sees the way of doing this by means of wisdom, contact, and mental cultivation. It's highly cognitive and almost intellectual. And you live in a world where suffering is just kind of regarded as not there. Very much Eastern concepts. Into the third stretch. Ethics. Very precise. Of all the religions, Islam is the most precise and easiest to grasp. I question whether that actually fits the reality of the complexity of life, but that's another issue. But it defines ethics in terms of rules. Very precise rules laid down in the Quran and Hadith. They can't be altered. They're enshrined in Sharia law. And the task of Islamic scholars is to interpret these rules, most of which developed in the 7th century, to interpret them into modern life. But you can't change the rules. They're there, they're fixed. And it sees Islam as God's religion. Now that is actually a phrase from the Quran. If it's God's religion, then what is right is what benefits Islam. That's a different concept of right and wrong compared to a Western mindset. Right is what benefits Islam. And we have to remember that underpins it. Looking at Christianity, it sets out absolute standards. But it defines these in terms of how we treat others, no matter who the others may be, what they've done to us, whether they deserve it or whether we can do anything back to us. It's all based on how we treat others. And this reflects God's nature. God's nature is described as God is love. The word love means God's agenda. He's seeking the best for you and me all the time, no matter how much we mess up. And our standards are regarded as no less than that. Hinduism. It speaks of virtue, right conduct, ethics and morality. and they're seen as everything that is essential for ordinary people, so that things in the world and our existence will all prosper together in a kind of harmony. And it defines all these things in terms of the harmony they produce. Again, a very different picture compared to either Islam or Christianity. Buddhism. It lists virtues, but there are variations within these lists. But we have to note that while it makes strong emphasis on no violence, in practice, violence is often justified and practiced even by the leaders of Buddhism, as we see in the world as I make this recording today. There's a quick picture of the ethical positions of the four religions. What do they say about afterlife? Let's start with Buddhism now. It sees a cycle of death and rebirth, gives it a name, samsara. It looks for eventual enlightenment, wisdom, and it hopes to escape this cycle and enter what it calls nirvana, an end to suffering. That's the goal. And that's the best picture it has of afterlife. Again, not a Western concept, but Eastern. Looking now at Islam. The Quran makes it very clear that most are destined to endless torture and hellfire forever. And it's spelt out in lurid, vivid terms, very physical terms. It also pictures some gaining entry to paradise, how it describes the afterlife. Paradise is described and pictured in sensual terms: good food, good drink. Always perspective is the male perspective, and in this paradise there's an endless supply of beautiful young ladies. But entry, the possibility of gaining paradise, is based on how well Islamic law has been followed. God's rulebook. And Sharia law is seen as God's law, which is why Muslims see it as above any national law. They see it as God's law. You've got to follow it, and follow it exactly. And how well you follow it determines the possibility of paradise. Christianity. There is a picture of judgment. Now, judgment is not a negative word in the original language. It's a word that carries with it the idea of God putting things right. There are elements of heaven and hell, grossly exaggerated in much Christian thought today. Go back into the Bible itself. Heaven is pictured in terms of being with the Lord, but hell, there's not much in the Bible when you look at it, partly because of translations. Words that don't really speak of the afterlife are also entitled hell, and we use the word hell in English in a general sense, meaning something completely miserable in this life. But what it does suggest is that there's some kind of separation. But Christianity's focus is on this life, not the afterlife. Islam's focus is on the afterlife, and this life is there to get entry to the afterlife. Somewhat different. Hinduism now. After death, it describes the soul experiencing the results of the thoughts it entertained and the actions it performed during its life on earth. In other words, we kind of reap what we sow. And that may involve reincarnation. But the ultimate goal, a bit like Buddhism, is absorption into deity. Pictures again very different. Suffering. It recognizes that all life is suffering, pain and misery. It recognizes too that most is caused by selfish craving and personal desire. It believes that these things can be overcome by self-effort. and it lays out an eightfold path of activities to minimize this misery. Things we can do, actions we can take, rituals we can go through. Christianity sees suffering as almost inevitable because there is freedom given to creation. We human beings have free will. And if free will means anything, it means we've got the freedom to mess up and to do it wrong. Otherwise, it's not real freedom. It never ever suggests that suffering is caused by God in any way. But it does recognize that God can transform us through suffering. But it's got a very strong emphasis on God's protection being available. And there are endless documented stories and autobiographies and events, and I've seen some of them with my own eyes, of the most amazing protection that God has given to people when faced with circumstances that are simply terrible. God can see us through and can transform us as well as enabling us to cope. Now that's positive. Hinduism. It sees religion, Hinduism, and spiritual practices. That's the kind of resources they enable us to cope with the kind of chronic pain of living. But the ultimate goal is to escape all that with absorption into deity. This time finally Islam. It's all seen as the will of Allah, not to be questioned. I remember vividly, after a major earthquake which killed 80,000 people in an Islamic country, discussing this, a Muslim made it very clear, and this expresses the Islamic mind. Must have been the will of Allah, she said. That was the end of the story. And it just leaves everything in God's hands. Don't question it. Just happens. These things just happen. Origin of evil now, and that links on to suffering in some ways. Starting with Buddhism. It doesn't separate good and evil. They're not neatly separated. It sees this kind of evil thing when we go our own way of self-interest. In Christianity, we're given freedom of choice to spiritual beings, the angels and humans. Freedom means we can choose to go the wrong way. We make the wrong choices with disastrous results. But if you ponder it for a moment, if we didn't have that freedom, then the concept of relationship and love have no meaning. Relationships are entered in by choice, free will. Otherwise it's just slavery and instinct. And love, having our agenda the best for the other, can only happen when we've got freedom of choice. It's worth pondering that. It does fit a lot of evidence. In Hinduism, it just simply sees evil as being the inevitable outcome of human free will. In Islam, it accepts the existence of evil spiritual beings. Sees their nature in terms of Satan. That's the Hebrew word Satan, meaning the adversary. In terms of Satan, failing to bow down to humankind, and then being allowed by God to tempt mankind. That's the picture description in the Quran. Quite how it relates to human responsibility isn't quite spelled out. although human responsibility is emphasized throughout. Moving on. Slightly different. How do we know? Christianity is evidence-centered. The Bible is a long book, historically based, able to be checked on many of its details. And we're invited to respond to what God has shown. And that basically can be seen tracking right throughout the Bible from the story of Abraham onwards. I bring Hinduism and Buddhism together in this. It kind of implies that we can know by searching and seeking, and we're trying to move towards understanding. Now that makes it kind of cognitive and intellectual. Where in Christianity is very much a response, which is not dependent on one's intellectual ability. God shows, we respond. In Islam, how do we know? It's very simple again. Just total obedience to what's taught in the key documents, as interpreted by reputable authorities. People who are trained in it, Islamic scholars, and there's a large number of them. You don't ask questions. You look at what's there. It's interpreted for us. Do it. That's our responsibility. And that's how we know how to live and what to do. Three very, very different ways of looking at things. And it's when we recognize that different religious areas come at these fundamental questions in different ways. They're not variants on each other. They are very, very different in their approaches. When we recognize that, we make a big step forward in understanding what's going on in the world. What's the central idea of these religions? That sets out the kind of goals and aims of human living, the goal being to be absorbed into deity. Central idea of Buddhism, to escape from suffering, following Buddhist practice, and of course eventually absorption in deity. Christianity, 2 words summarize everything. Grace is God doing for us what we can't do for ourselves, and love is God's agenda is the best for humanity, all humanity, no matter how much we mess up. It's expressed in the nature of God himself, which we're supposed to be like mirrors reflecting. Islam, well, the word means submission. And that is the central idea of Islam. It is so simple. Submit to God, obey the Prophet, which means the Quran, the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, and these are brought together in shrine and enshrined in Sharia law. Submit, do what you're told, obedience, don't ask questions. Very simple, very straightforward. And again, these 4 central ideas are very, very different in emphasis. Differences? Looking now at Christianity compared to the others. Christianity is centered on historical events. The Bible could be described as a spiritual history. Many of the people, places, situations, cultural practices, the events, they can all be checked by reference to other sources and documents and archaeology. It's very historically centered, highly recorded. All the other religions, and that's true of every religion except Christianity, they may share a lot of ground in some areas, but self-effort is the means of improvement. They recognize things are not as they should be, and it prescribes and lays down ways to make things better, and it's self-effort as the means of improvement. But Christianity is different because it's got this unique concept of grace. Now, I know the word grace occurs in the Quran, but it has a different meaning there. Concept of grace, God doing for us what we couldn't do for ourselves, we certainly don't deserve and we cannot earn. That is a unique concept, and it runs right throughout the Bible from beginning to end. Developed most fully, of course, in the New Testament in the life of Jesus. That's the opposite of self-effort. God knows that we can't do it by self-effort. But when we want to do it, He can release the resources to help us to do it, because He's on our side. All religions, sadly, have an awful lot of that. Self-effort means religious performance, which involves religious ritual. Now, it's not supposed to be in Christianity. Jesus never came to set up a religious system. And He lays down in His entire life and teaching, and indeed in the teaching throughout the New Testament, it is not laid down about religious ritual and performance. Much of it is pushed aside, deliberately and clearly. Sadly, in many Christian groups, it's crept in over the centuries and doing immense damage today. But in every religion, there's too much of that. And the one thing that stands out within Christianity is equality and equal opportunity. When you look at every other religion, in some way and in some context, this fails. From the idea of wealth and prosperity being a sign of God's favour and reward in Eastern religions, and therefore you look down on those who are the lower castes, right across to the ideas within Islam where it specifically teaches that God only loves Muslims. Equality and equal opportunity is central, and again Jesus broke through the cultural and religious taboos of his day with that great message, and He lived it out. Things that should not be in Christianity and in the Bible, they are not there. Things that are in Christianity but not in other religions. And I invite you to look at the logic of Christianity and ask the question, which fits the facts better? Which fits the evidence better? Are we really capable as a human race by self-effort of improving ourselves? The evidence from history shows we're not. Does religious ritual and performance do anything for us? Makes us feel inwardly good we've done something. Signifies nothing. It's often in a world of unreality. You can check history, but grace recognizes human weakness. And equality and equal opportunity are central ideas that are needed in the world today. I invite you to look at these other religions, even though this overview has been very superficial and in some ways inadequate. The logic of Christianity does fit the evidence. Christianity says that things have gone wrong, and looking out in the world, it's certainly true. We are not capable of putting things right without help. History is full of great efforts to try and do that. They don't work. It claims, Christianity, that God entered the human race in the life of Jesus, the human arena. He couldn't come in overwhelming force to sort things out, because that would have destroyed humanity, because it would have overruled our free will. To make the point, He came in the vulnerability of a child, teaching us what life should be, showing us what life should be. He took on the evil in the world with a total integrity and defeated it. And His invitation is to share with Him in restoring God's creation. We take the decision. He provides the resources. And that faces the reality of the human predicament. That's what I'm suggesting. Because when we look at what other religions have contributed, there are good insights, not so good insights. But the insights that come from Jesus, not from a religious system, not from a theology, not from a philosophy, but the insights from Jesus. They fit the observed evidence best. They make greatest sense of our worlds, and they give us hope for the future. That is the logic of Christianity. In the next part, we're going to move on and expand slightly, looking at the area of suffering.